Camping with an alien vampire. Her unexpected hug left me speechless. Whispers in the mist. The crisp mountain air carried whispers through the pines as Morgan Hayes adjusted his telescope on the rocky outcrop. Eldridge Valley stretched before him, a natural observatory far from city lights where the heavens revealed themselves in stunning clarity. His sabbatical from teaching astronomy at Westlake University had brought him to this isolated research station to document the Perseid Omega, a meteor shower that appeared only once every 70 years. "Come on, give me something spectacular," he murmured, checking his equipment again. At 42, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that had spent too many nights searching the stars, Morgan had built his career on careful observation. Yet lately, the vastness between those stars had begun to mirror the emptiness in his own life. The first meteors streaked across the velvet sky, but something was different. They didn't follow predicted patterns, instead converging at a point directly above the northern ridge. Morgan frantically recorded readings as the meteors intensified, forming what appeared to be a swirling portal of light. "This isn't possible," he whispered, abandoning his equipment to stare unobstructed at the phenomenon. A final flash illuminated the entire valley before darkness returned, heavier than before. Something had changed in the atmosphere. Morgan felt it in the subtle pressure against his skin, in the electric tingle that raised the hair on his arms. Scientific curiosity overrode caution as he packed essential gear into his backpack and began hiking toward the northern ridge where the light had been most concentrated. The mist thickened as he climbed, moonlight filtering through in ghostly beams. 3 hours of difficult terrain later, Morgan reached a small clearing and froze. At its center lay a shallow crater, steam rising from scorched earth. And beside it a figure. "Hello?" Morgan called cautiously, approaching with slow steps. "Are you hurt?" The figure turned and Morgan's breath caught. She appeared human at first glance, slender with delicate features, but the subtle violet tint of her skin became apparent as she moved into a shaft of moonlight. Her eyes reflected the starlight with an iridescence that no human eyes possessed. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice carrying a melodic cadence that seemed to resonate in his chest rather than his ears. "Eldridge Valley, North America, Earth," Morgan answered automatically, scientific training kicking in despite his shock. What are you?" "My name is Lyra." She stood with fluid grace. "I am not from here." Morgan's mind raced through possibilities. Hallucination, elaborate hoax, or the incredible truth that seemed to hover between them. The meteor shower. It wasn't natural, was it? Lyra's expression shifted to something like relief. "You understand more than most would." "No, it was not natural. It was a gateway, though not one I intended to use." She gestured to a small device on her wrist, its crystal components cracked. "My transit was damaged. I cannot return home yet." A distant rumble of thunder broke the moment. Morgan glanced at the sky, noting the rapidly gathering clouds. "A storm's coming and it's going to be severe. You can't stay out here." He hesitated, weighing decades of scientific skepticism against what stood before him. "My research cabin is 2 miles south. It's basic, but it's shelter." Lyra studied him with those impossible eyes. "Why would you help me?" Morgan couldn't fully explain it himself. The pull he felt toward her was beyond scientific curiosity. "Because you're lost. And because if I left you here, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering if I'd imagined you." The first heavy raindrops began to fall as Lyra nodded. "Very well, Morgan Hayes. I will accompany you." He hadn't told her his name. As they descended through the darkening forest, lightning illuminated their path in stuttering flashes. Morgan noticed how Lyra moved with perfect balance despite the difficult terrain, how her eyes seemed to adjust instantly to darkness. With each step, the reality of her alienness settled deeper into his understanding. "Your world is very loud," she remarked as they walked. "The energies here are chaotic, but beautiful." Morgan found himself smiling despite the strangeness of it all. "Wait until you see it in daylight." They reached the cabin just as the storm unleashed its full fury. As Morgan unlocked the door, he realized his orderly life of stellar calculations and academic papers had just collided with something beyond all his theories. Whatever Lyra was, wherever she came from, nothing would be the same again. Sheltered Heart's thunder cracked overhead as Morgan lit the cabin's oil lamps. The research station was modest, A main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom, and equipment storage. But it felt suddenly smaller with Lyra's presence. She moved about the space with curious grace, fingers hovering near objects without touching them. "Your dwelling contains much metal," she observed, her violet skin catching amber highlights in the lamplight. "It's just temporary. My real home is back in the city," Morgan explained, setting a kettle to boil on the propane stove. He watched as she approached his wall of research notes and star charts. "Do you recognize any of those constellations?" Lyra tilted her head, causing her silvery hair to cascade over one shoulder. "Your perspective is different. From my world, your sun is part of a cluster we call the Seventh Harmony." She pointed to a blank area of his star chart. "My home would be there, though your instruments cannot detect it yet." Morgan offered her tea, which she accepted with careful hands. "How did you end up here? Was it an accident or—" "Not entirely." Lyra's iridescent eyes met his. "I am a wayfinder, one who studies spatial bridges between realms. I was tracking an energy anomaly that appeared near your world." She gestured to her damaged wrist device. "I came too close to your atmosphere, and the gravitational shift disrupted my transit corridor." Outside, the storm intensified. Rain lashed against windows while wind howled through the mountain pines. Inside, the cabin felt increasingly like a pocket universe where normal rules were suspended. "How long will it take to repair your transit?" Morgan asked, trying to maintain scientific detachment despite the wonder of her existence. "The alignment cycle must complete. 17 of your Earth days." Lyra sipped the tea, her expression revealing surprise at the taste. "This is pleasant." Morgan ran a hand through his hair, reality sinking in. 17 days alone with a being from another world. His academic mind raced with questions, but something more personal stirred beneath his curiosity. "You should rest," he said finally. "You can take the bedroom. I'll sleep out here." "Your species requires significant recovery time," Lyra noted. "I need only brief meditation cycles." "Even so," Morgan insisted. Later, as rain drummed against the roof, Morgan lay on the couch unable to sleep. The storm had knocked out the power, leaving only flickering lamplight. He startled when Lyra emerged from the bedroom, her skin emitting a faint phosphorescence in the darkness. "You are troubled," she stated, settling cross-legged on the floor near him. "I'm an astronomer who spent his life studying the possibility of life beyond Earth. And now you're here, in my cabin." He laughed softly. "It's a lot to process." "Your isolation puzzles me," Lyra said. "Your energy signature suggests depth of feeling, yet you dwell alone, far from others." Morgan was struck by her perception. "My work has always come first, relationships, complicated things. Among my people, connection is essential. Isolation weakens our essence." Lyra's voice softened. "You carry loneliness like a familiar companion." The observation cut closer than Morgan expected. "And what about you? Don't you have connections on your world?" Something like sadness passed across Lyra's features. "I am different even among my kind. My abilities made me valuable as a wayfinder, but separate." The howling wind crescendoed and the cabin creaked under its force. A sharp crack outside was followed by a thunderous crash that shook the foundations. "Tree down," Morgan said, rising quickly. "Probably across the access road." Lyra moved to the window, her body tensing. "The energy patterns are unstable. This storm is not entirely natural." "What do you mean?" "My arrival may have disrupted your atmospheric balance." Concern etched her features. "My presence here causes ripples." As if confirming her words, a blinding flash illuminated the cabin as lightning struck terrifyingly close. The concussion threw them both backward, Morgan instinctively catching Lyra as they fell. For a moment they remained frozen, her surprisingly warm body against his, her heartbeat a rapid rhythm unlike any human pulse. "Are you all right?" he asked, suddenly aware of their proximity. Lyra didn't immediately move away. Your protective instinct emerged without thought. Fascinating. Morgan helped her up, ignoring the unexpected warmth spreading through his chest. "Human reflex," he explained awkwardly. They spent the remainder of the night in conversation, the storm raging around them seemingly forgotten. Lyra described her world, a place of floating archipelagos surrounding a crystalline core, where her people communicated through both words and energy transference. Morgan shared stories of Earth's diverse cultures and landscapes, surprised by how her questions made him see his own world with fresh wonder. By dawn, The storm had passed, leaving a transformed landscape of fallen trees and swollen streams. But something else had shifted too. The careful distance Morgan had maintained. As they stood on the cabin porch surveying the damage, he realized the scientific observer in him was being steadily overtaken by something far more dangerous. Connection. Celestial rhythms 5 days passed in a strange harmony of discovery. Morgan documented everything with a scientist's precision, while teaching Lyra about human customs. She approached each lesson with intense curiosity, from the preparation of scrambled eggs to the concept of music, which particularly fascinated her. These vibrations create feelings, she marveled, listening to Morgan's old jazz records. We have something similar, but it works directly through energy fields. Could you show me? Morgan asked, his notebook ever present. Lyra hesitated, then extended her hand. It requires contact. Morgan set aside his notes and placed his palm against hers. Immediately, a tingling sensation traveled up his arm, spreading across his chest. Then came waves of emotion, not his own, but clearly communicated. Curiosity, appreciation, a hint of something warmer. The experience lasted only seconds before Lyra withdrew her hand. That was... Morgan struggled to find scientific terminology that could adequately describe it. A simple greeting. Lyra finished, a slight violet flush coloring her cheeks. Among close companions, the sharing is much deeper. Each day brought new revelations. Lyra could perceive energy patterns invisible to humans, seeing electricity flowing through wires, detecting the bioelectric fields of animals in the forest. Morgan found her perspective revolutionary, challenging fundamental assumptions about physics he'd held his entire career. Your scientists are close to understanding, but they separate forces that are actually connected, she explained one evening as they hiked to the ridge to check atmospheric readings. Morgan had never felt so intellectually stimulated, yet increasingly it wasn't just her knowledge that drew him. It was her way of moving through the world, her balance of analytical thought and intuitive understanding, her moments of unexpected humor, the quiet grace with which she absorbed everything around her. On the 7th night, a massive solar flare knocked out power across the region. Morgan lit the cabin with candles, creating a warm glow that softened the scientific equipment cluttering the space. The solar radiation will interfere with my readings, he sighed, closing his laptop as the battery died. Perhaps a moment without measurement would be beneficial, Lyra suggested. She had taken to wearing Morgan's spare clothing, a simple t-shirt and sweatpants that somehow looked elegant on her slender frame. Your constant recording creates distance from experience, Morgan smiled ruefully. Occupational hazard. I've spent my life observing rather than participating. Tonight, participate, Lyra said. She moved to the center of the room and closed her eyes in concentration. Gradually, points of light appeared around her, tiny glowing spheres that rose from her violet skin like luminescent pollen. They drifted upward, multiplying until dozens filled the cabin's ceiling, swirling in patterns that mimicked galactic rotation. Morgan stood transfixed as the miniature cosmos expanded around them. It's beautiful, he whispered, stepping into the field of dancing lights. Each sphere pulsed in rhythm, creating a silent symphony of illumination. On my world, this is how we celebrate celestial conjunctions, Lyra explained, her voice soft as the lights reflected in her eyes. A remembrance that we are part of the greater pattern. Without thinking, Morgan reached for her hand. This time, when their palms met, the energy transfer felt different, warmer, more intimate. The lights around them responded, pulsing brighter, their orbital patterns accelerating. Morgan, Lyra's voice carried a new tone. Your energy has become entangled with mine. Is that dangerous? He asked, though he made no move to step away. Not dangerous, but significant. Her free hand rose to touch his face, fingers tracing his jawline with delicate precision. My people form connections differently than humans, but I believe the core experience may be similar. Morgan felt years of scientific detachment melting away under her touch. And what experience is that? Instead of answering with words, Lyra leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The contact triggered a cascade of sensation, not just physical warmth, but waves of emotion and memory. For a breathtaking moment, Morgan glimpsed fragments of her world. Crystalline spires reaching toward twin moons, beings of light communicating through pulsing energy, the vast empty spaces Lyra had traversed alone. When they parted, the floating lights had formed a spiral around them, spinning slowly like a galaxy in miniature. Morgan's hands trembled slightly as he brushed silver hair from Lyra's face. That was definitely not in any astronomy textbook, he murmured. Lyra's laugh was like wind through crystal. Perhaps it should be. What followed transcended both their worlds, a communion of touch and energy that blurred the boundaries between them. As clothing gave way to exploration, Morgan discovered that beneath her alien nature, Lyra's form echoed human anatomy in ways that made their connection possible, if uniquely intense. Her skin against his created currents of pleasure that spiraled outward, the bioluminescent lights responding to their every movement until the cabin seemed filled with shooting stars. In the aftermath, they lay entwined, the glowing spheres slowly fading as Lyra's energy settled. Morgan traced patterns on her violet skin, connecting invisible constellations between them. 17 days, he murmured, reality intruding on their cocoon. That's how long until you can repair your transit. Lyra's fingers found his, intertwining. 9 days now? Neither spoke the question hanging between them. What would happen when those 9 days ended? Instead, they held each other beneath the last fading lights. Two beings from separate worlds who had somehow, against astronomical odds, found resonance in each other's frequencies. Fading horizons. The days slipped away like sand through an hourglass. Morgan and Lyra fell into a rhythm that felt both miraculous and precarious. Mornings spent collecting data on the atmospheric anomalies, afternoons exploring the valley, evenings lost in conversations that bridged their worlds, and nights when the boundaries between their species seemed to dissolve entirely in waves of shared energy and intimacy. On the 12th day, they hiked to Eagle Point, the highest accessible peak in the range. The autumn air carried a crispness that hinted at coming winter, though Morgan barely noticed the cold with Lyra beside him. Her natural warmth seemed to intensify as her transit date approached, as though her body was preparing for the journey home. Your planet has such extremes, Lyra observed, watching golden leaves spiral down from the aspens. Constant change, constant cycles. Is your world more stable? Morgan asked, setting up his portable weather station. We exist in perpetual twilight. Our binary stars create overlapping day cycles that never fully darken. She closed her eyes, breathing in the mountain air. But we lack this diversity of life. Your world teems with it. They reached the summit by midday. Below them, Eldridge Valley stretched in panoramic glory, a tapestry of forest meadows and the silver ribbon of a river cutting through it all. Morgan positioned his instruments while Lyra moved to the eastern edge of the outcropping, her posture suddenly alert. Something's wrong, she said, her voice tightening. Morgan joined her, following her gaze to a distant thunderhead forming unnaturally fast over the eastern peaks. The cloud mass swirled with unnatural colors, purples and greens that no earthly storm should contain. Another atmospheric disturbance? He asked, already reaching for his equipment. Lyra's expression darkened. No, this is different. She extended her hands toward the storm, eyes closing in concentration. After a moment, they snapped open, filled with alarm. It's a transit echo, a reaction to my arrival. The dimensional barrier is thinning unpredictably. Morgan's scientific mind raced to process the implications. Is it dangerous? Potentially catastrophic. Lyra's fingers worked rapidly over her wrist device. These readings suggest cascading failures in the fabric between our worlds. They hurried back to the cabin, the strange storm growing behind them despite the absence of wind. Inside, Lyra connected her transit device to Morgan's computer, creating a hybrid interface that displayed data patterns he'd never seen before. My presence is causing this, she explained, her voice heavy. When I arrived, the transit corridor didn't fully close. It's creating a tear that's growing exponentially. Morgan studied the screen, understanding enough to recognize disaster. What happens if the tear continues? Energy discharge on a massive scale, potentially an uncontrolled corridor between worlds. She looked up at him, eyes reflecting the gravity of her words. Your valley would be the epicenter, but the effects could spread globally. The implications hung between them like a physical weight. Morgan ran simulations based on Lyra's data, each result more alarming than the last. There must be something we can do, he insisted, refusing to accept the dire predictions. Lyra was quiet for a long moment. There is one solution, she finally said, her voice barely audible. I must leave immediately. My transit isn't fully repaired. But if I activate it now and return through the tear, I can use my Wayfinder abilities to seal it from the other side. But you said it would take 17 days for proper repair. Morgan felt suddenly cold. What happens if you attempt transit before then? She wouldn't meet his eyes. The journey becomes uncertain, meaning I may not reach my intended destination. Her words were carefully chosen. The probability of being lost between realms is significant. Morgan felt the world tilting beneath him. That's suicide. It's necessity. Lyra finally looked up. My people would make the same choice. The needs of both our worlds outweigh one life. That night, as the anomalous storm continued to build on the horizon, they clung to each other with desperate intensity. Morgan tried to memorize everything, the exact shade of her violet skin in lamplight, the subtle luminescence that appeared along her spine when emotion overwhelmed her, the precise cadence of her breathing as she slept briefly beside him. We'll find another way, he whispered into her silver hair. But morning brought no revelations, only deteriorating conditions. The tear had grown, causing electromagnetic disruptions that disabled communications across the region. Strange auroras rippled across the daylight sky in fractured patterns. As they stood on the porch watching the phenomenon, Lyra suddenly doubled over in pain. What is it? Morgan asked, alarmed. The tear, she gasped. It's pulling at me, recognizing my energy signature as foreign. She straightened with visible effort. I don't have a choice anymore, Morgan. I must go today. They gathered the necessary equipment and hiked to the northern ridge where she had first appeared. The crater remained, now pulsing with unstable energy that made the air shimmer like a heat mirage. Lyra worked methodically, connecting her wrist device to components she'd constructed from modified parts of Morgan's equipment. This should create enough of a directed corridor for me to enter the tear, she explained, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. Morgan knelt beside her, helping to calibrate the makeshift instruments. His hands moved automatically while his mind rebelled against what was happening. After 2 weeks that had transformed his understanding of the universe and his heart, he was about to lose her. Come with me, Lyra suddenly suggested, looking up from her work with intensity burning in her iridescent eyes. Morgan stared at her. What? It's possible. Difficult and dangerous, but possible. Her words tumbled out rapidly. If we modify the transit field to encompass both our energy signatures— You just said the transit was uncertain even for you, Morgan interrupted. Adding me would make it more unstable, wouldn't it? Lyra didn't deny it. Yes, but we could be together. For one wild moment, Morgan considered it, abandoning his world, his career, everything he'd known, to follow her into the stars. The temptation was almost overwhelming. Your world might not sustain human life, he said softly, forcing himself to think rationally. And if neither of us reaches your home, who would seal the tear? The truth settled between them, inescapable as gravity. One of them had to stay. One had to go. Their time together had always been borrowed against cosmic law. As Lyra completed the final adjustments to her transit device, the sky darkened ominously. The tear was growing visible to the naked eye now, a shifting distortion in reality that bent light around its edges. It's time, she said, rising to her feet. Morgan pulled her into his arms one last time, his scientist's composure finally breaking. In all the universe, across all possible worlds, he whispered, finding you was the miracle I never thought to look for. Lyra placed her hand over his heart. Among my people, when energy patterns harmonize as perfectly as ours, we believe they remain connected across any distance. A subtle glow emanated from her palm, seeping into his chest with gentle warmth. A piece of my essence will remain with you. She stepped back toward the pulsing crater, transit device humming with increasing intensity. The air around her began to shimmer, her outline becoming less distinct. Morgan Hayes, she said, her voice already sounding distant. Look for me in the stars. A blinding flash engulfed her, forcing Morgan to shield his eyes. When he could see again, Lyra was gone, and with her the anomalous storm and the dimensional tear. Only the disturbed earth of the crater remained as evidence she had ever existed. Morgan stood alone on the ridge, the ordinary sounds of the forest returning around him. Only the lingering warmth in his chest, pulsing with a rhythm not quite human, suggested that what had happened was more than a dream. Convergent paths, 3 months passed. Winter transformed Eldridge Valley into a crystalline landscape that Morgan barely noticed. He moved through his days mechanically, documenting everything related to Lyra's visit with scientific precision, while privately wondering if grief could actually alter a person's molecular structure. The warmth she had left in his chest remained, a constant subtle reminder that pulsed with her distinctive rhythm. His sabbatical ended. The university expected him back for the spring semester, but Morgan requested an extension, claiming his research required continuous monitoring. In truth, he couldn't bear to leave the valley where fragments of Lyra's energy might still linger. The scientific papers he published about atmospheric anomalies and previously unrecorded meteor shower patterns garnered attention in the astronomy community. What he didn't publish, the truth about Lyra, remained in journals locked in his cabin safe. Some discoveries were too profound, too personal to share. On the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Morgan hiked to the northern ridge despite heavy snow and sub-zero temperatures. The crater where Lyra had appeared and vanished was now a frozen depression, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know its significance. He set up his most sensitive equipment, calibrated to detect the specific energy signatures he had recorded during her stay. For hours he sat in the biting cold, eyes alternating between his instruments and the star-filled sky. "Looking for me in the stars, Morgan Hayes?" The voice came from behind him, carrying that familiar melodic resonance that seemed to vibrate in his chest rather than his ears. Morgan turned slowly, afraid that hope and loneliness had finally broken his mind. Lyra stood at the edge of the clearing, her violet skin almost luminous against the snow. She wore strange garments that seemed to shift with her movements, but her eyes, those iridescent, impossible eyes, were exactly as he remembered. How was all he could manage, rising on unsteady feet. The tear was sealed, but not in the way I expected. She moved toward him with that fluid grace. When I entered the transit corridor, I discovered it wasn't collapsing, it was being stabilized. Morgan's scientific mind struggled to process her words through the fog of emotion. "Stabilized by what?" "By whom?" she corrected. "My people had detected the anomaly. They sent a containment team that intercepted my transit." Her expression softened. "They healed me, repaired the corridor properly, and were quite interested in my observations of Earth." "You're really here?" Morgan reached for her, half expecting his hand to pass through an illusion. Instead, his fingers met warm, solid reality. The moment they touched, the warmth in his chest flared in recognition. "The energy signature I left with you," Lyra said, placing her palm over his heart. "It created a beacon I could follow back." "But how can you stay?" Morgan asked, afraid to embrace the hope building inside him. "Won't your presence cause the same problems?" "Not anymore." She held up her wrist, showing a new, more sophisticated version of her transit device. Properly calibrated dimensional harmonizers and... She hesitated, seeming almost shy. "My people are intrigued by Earth. They've approved an extended research mission, a cultural exchange of sorts." "How extended?" Morgan barely dared to ask. "Years, perhaps. Time enough to fully document the seasonal cycles you mentioned. Time enough to experience those human customs we only began to explore." Her eyes held his. "Time enough to discover where this connection between us leads." The implications washed over him in waves. "Your people approve this?" "Not initially." A smile touched her lips. "But I showed them our research. The unique harmony between our energy signatures, the scientific potential of sustained contact." Her fingers traced his jawline. "And I may have convinced our council that I was the ideal ambassador given my personal investment in this world." Morgan pulled her into his arms then, the scientist in him finally surrendering completely to the man who had fallen in love with a being from the stars. Their kiss sent cascades of warmth through his body, the energy signature in his chest resonating with her presence. When they parted, Lyra's skin glowed with subtle bioluminescence that mirrored the starlight above. "There is one condition to my staying," she said, suddenly serious. "Name it." "Knowledge exchange must flow both ways. Eventually, when Earth is ready, when your scientific community can accept the reality of other realms." She gestured toward the stars. "You would need to visit my world as well." Morgan looked up at the night sky, seeing it now not as a subject of study, but as a sea of possibilities. "I think I could manage that." Spring returned to Eldridge Valley, bringing renewal to the land and to Morgan's life. The university was perplexed but ultimately supportive when he explained his need for a more permanent research station, especially after his papers on interstellar energy patterns began revolutionizing theoretical physics. The cabin expanded to include a proper laboratory where Morgan and Lyra worked side by side, bridging the knowledge of their worlds. On paper, she was his research assistant, recently arrived from abroad. In reality, she was his partner in every sense, teaching him about cosmic forces while learning the intricacies of human emotion and culture. Their evenings often ended on the porch, watching the stars appear one by one. Sometimes Lyra would create her miniature galaxies of floating light, setting them dancing around them in celebration of another day together. "Do you ever regret it?" Morgan asked one such night, his arm around her shoulders. "Choosing to stay in a world so different from your own?" Lyra's eyes reflected the constellations above. "My people believe that all paths in the cosmos eventually converge. Some just take more interesting routes than others." She turned to him, the violet of her skin deepening with emotion. "This path with you is exactly where I'm meant to be." As if in answer, a meteor streaked across the sky, a reminder that sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with a single, unexpected fall from the stars. The universe in all its vastness had brought together two beings from separate worlds, and in doing so it had created something unique in any galaxy, a love that transcended the very stars themselves.